Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this seminar, this YouTube seminar, Great Ideas, Not Ideology, Relativism, and the Struggle for a Stable Society. I'm Dr. Gordon Carkner, and I work as a meta educator for UBC graduate students. This is my blog address, ubcgcu.org. The author of Mapping the Future and the Great Escape from Nihilism. This is a picture of UBC from the air. Nice campus, nice location. I want to give you an overview of relativism at a popular level first, and then go into more detail. So we'll try and give a kind of analysis of what relativism believes and some critique and maybe some alternative ways of approaching ethics in the future. So relativism first as a popular ethos. The individual relativist, or soft relativist, I guess you could say, makes up morality as life unfolds, choosing from different religions, ideological and philosophical traditions, according to personal preferences. The relativist doctrine has some of the following stipulations. Morality is taken as a matter of existential self-construction. There's nothing transcendent, traditional, objective, or systematic about my values. Moral convictions belong strictly to me, my individual free will or personal choice. This is my right, my thing, I do it my way. Tolerance, that doctrine that believes in living and let live, live and let live, becomes a necessary sanction of another individual's views or opinions in order to get along within a pluralistic, multi-ideological, multicultural society. And of course, with globalization, people have values provided to them by a vast global network, including the internet and social media. This is where we get into those various tribes, echo chambers, and the culture wars. Finally, there are no final absolutes for relativists. For the relativist, no right or wrong, no transcendent source of the good, only individual views over against social constructions, personal values within a marketplace of moral ideas and ideals. Actually, it can become quite intense at times with strong opinions, as we see in the debates around political correctness, cancel culture, and public shaming. Relativism goes to university. As we know, as we know from this author, Christian Smith, and professor at Notre Dame, in his award-winning book, Souls in Transition, Americans 18 to 23 have some of the following characteristics, and he finds some of them in his research rather enlightening. First of all, soft ontological anti-realists. They don't believe that there's a really real world out there. Epistemological skeptics. They question every truth claim, including moral truths. Perspectivalists, various ways to see things. Mine is only one of many. Subjective isolation. My own unique path in life is what's important, but I have a sense of loneliness as well. Constructivists, building myself and my morality for the ground up is my major project. Moral intuitionists, how I feel about a situation or decision is the most important factor, even if I am uncritical about such feelings. Such feelings could be off base. This overall creates an antipathy towards parental shaping, social conventions, and institutional morality. So you can, in a sense, see that there's a kind of rebellion involved in this. This posture entails the sovereignty of the self as a key arbiter of moral judgment. Robert Bellah and his colleagues wrote about this in Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life, where he actually compared the individualist who is pro-community, in favor of community, to the individualist that is very self-oriented and very separate from community. And Charles Taylor wrote about this ethics of authenticity in one of his books. I remember hearing a lecture by leading postmodern thinker Richard Rorty from California. He's an American pragmatist philosopher. And this is a quote from him: "Truth is what your contemporaries let you get away with." That's an aspect of the relativistic mindset today. He was actually quite against morality. He was against moral norms. He felt they were oppressive to society. But a different moral philosopher comes from Richard R. Scott Smith at Biola University. Here's a quote from his book, In Search of Moral Knowledge. Ethical relativism claims that we know how things really are for all people, that morals are relative to individuals or cultures. It is a constructivist approach to ethics. What makes something right is something we choose. It is a questionable view of the nature of morality. It leaves us unaccountable and makes it easy to rationalize any behavior. We should not settle for a relativistic based tolerance, since this would not succeed in building a moral society or in helping people be moral. That kind of morality forces us to consider all the ideas as being equally valid, yet we know that this is not the case. And here's his, his rejoinder. Nevertheless, tolerance, that is, respect for people as having equal value, would make sense if we could find a universal objective moral basis that exists for that equality. So we must ask the question, why should we be good, treat others with respect, kindness, and compassion? Why should we fight for equality of opportunity and justice, human rights, and free speech? Where is morality to be grounded? I remember a conversation with some moral philosophers a few years ago in which they just basically had given up on the idea of finding a universal foundation for morality. What if we, this is a slide which shows what we might be headed for in society, what we might desire as a human community: cooperation, self-discipline, excellence, consideration, trust, honesty, respect, creativity, confidence, courage, and determination. But how do we get there if we are living on a doctrine that is fallacious, moral, ethical relativism, or moral subjectivism? I want to give you a little bit of a historical perspective on this topic. A sociologist at University of Virginia, top sociologist James Davison Hunter, gave a lecture at a university in Utah, which he talked about the historic sea change in moral perceptions. Here are some of his thoughts that I've summarized from that talk. In modernity, we've experienced a structural transformation in our view of morality, both a radical deinstitutionalization and subjectivization. It's part of the liberation of the expressive, creative, post-structuralist self. A good example of that would be Michel Foucault, which I studied in my PhD thesis on his idea of the moral self. Self is prior to or outside of community, acting as both a deconstructionist and a constructionist. I remembered a quote from William Connolly commenting on the relationship between Charles Taylor and Michel Foucault. Taylor basically sees the self as integrated in community. Michel Foucault sees the self as totally separate from community and must liberate itself from community or from the structures of society. This form of morality avoids the why question with respect to good behavior or moral values. And we suggest that that's a major loss. Reduces morality to the therapeutic or utilitarian reasoning, with reasoning like this feels good, it works for me, and a paranoia about making truth claims regarding moral issues. And people often say after they make a comment, that's just my opinion, of course, you do you. Hunter says that this really empties morality of meaning, significance, substance, obligation, and authority. It becomes a shell of what it once was. Reduces morality to the thinnest of platitudes, separate from social, cultural, and historical embeddedness or connectedness. Merleau-Ponty, a French philosopher, talks a lot about this importance of embeddedness, and Emmanuel Levinas speaks strongly about the idea of responsibility for the other, which is lacking in many post-structuralist positions. They are highly individualistic. Well, what's important to realize is that this has never existed before in history. Real morality requires social networks, rituals, worldviews, a communal narrative to form a moral memory. And I want to read this quote from Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self. High ethical standards require strong moral sources. And today, these moral sources are quite weak. They're residing largely within the radical autonomous individual. So that's a bit of a historical overview. Now we turn to some of the internal inconsistencies within relativism. Relativistic ethics cannot prove that relativistic ethics contains a high value. One could say at most, in my opinion, relativistic ethics is just fine. Relativistic ethics is hung up on its own premise, that is, it contradicts itself. In fact, we note that relativism is not an insight into reality, rather it is a projected value imposed upon reality, i.e. that all is relative, a questionable meta-ethical claim that doesn't work, we are suggesting. In no way is it immediately obvious that all is relative. Relative to what, we might ask? This stance would require a standard or interpretive framework to determine what is a solid moral anchor versus what is relative to that standard. And someone who noticed this problem, the problem of moral relativism or ethical relativism, is new atheist Sam Harris. He recognizes the danger of losing moral foundations. And he wrote about this in his book, The Moral Landscape. So he tries to offer a scientific foundation for ethics. And in response to that, we have J.D. Hunter and Paul Nedalewski in their book, Science and the Good, where they begin to critique that idea of a scientific foundation for ethics and what it produces. So in fact, what has emerged in the modern era is not the end of absolutes, ultimate loyalties or principles, but the multiplication of absolutes. Russian thinker Sergei Levitsky said, the relativization of the absolute leads to the absolutization of the relatives. It should not be shocking to learn how much these absolutes conflict with each other, ergo our modern culture wars. As you know, there is big money to be made by social influencers shaping the opinion among today's youth. So you just choose your absolute and run with it. And you're empowered by algorithms in social media. The result of this, of ethical relativism, is a kind of a crisis that we have in modern society, the loss of moral skill and knowledge. Consequently, and this is articulated really well by Matthew Crawford in his book, The World Beyond Your Head. Consequently, we lose our moral skill or wisdom, our ability to discern good from evil, right from wrong, virtue from vice. This leads to the confusion of anomie, or that sense of normlessness, lawlessness, to create a personal vulnerability to manipulation by our authorities through propaganda, lies, half-truths, and alternative facts. We witness this phenomenon of political cult following today. So at the end of the day, we end up with a kind of contemporary moral illiteracy. It makes us weak, less human, less free, and we need to rebuild the inner moral self. The posture of relativism gives the hero and the villain equal honor. Mother Teresa is seen as equally good to murderer Charles Manson. Joseph Stalin matches the value of Jesus of Nazareth. The criminal prosecution is equal to the Nobel Prize. This is surely to take a position of absurdity, filling us with internal ambivalence, confusion, and dissonance. Who's to say what is better, people might ask. So there are consequences of relativism, and I would like to summarize a short little talk by a university professor in this. There's a video, but I won't play the video. I'll just summarize it in the next slide. So must we make up and fight for our own reality? So here's how the logic goes. If we each have our own morality, communication will be impossible. Without a common reality, there can be no common truth, no true communion between people. Reality, at the end of the day, is a measure of truth for you and for me. If we claim to inhabit a different reality, I will have to make you yield to my meaning, my vision of truth, or you will have to make me yield to yours. We have no objective arbiter between us. Either I submit to you or you submit to me, and this leads to conflict, as we see in Jean-Paul Sartre's play, No Exit. Remember, the final line in that play was, hell is other people. We are trapped in a nasty loop of continuous mutual manipulation, and that indeed is the state of nihilism. That play really expresses well the state of nihilism. Intimacy and communion would be impossible. It would be a battle of the gods. We are destined to reside in a different cosmos from each other. The one who has more power will win, the other will lose. But our deepest instinct for communion is blocked by our isolation from one another. We are atomistic, radically individualistic, alone. We need a common vision, a common reality, common truth to flourish, not incommensurability. Otherwise, we have a moral sickness or angst at the heart of society. We are broken. A good example of this is the controversy over wearing masks to fight the COVID spread in our day. So what we're trying to say here is, to some extent, ethical relativism is a poison chalice. Does the road to human prosperity lead through relativism? We fear it does not. The ideology would destroy trust, tear apart the fabric of society, and lead to totalitarianism, oppression, bullying, inequality, racism, and abuse. It destroys our motivation for hard work and sacrifice, as the rules are changed to serve the self-interest of plutocrats and oligarchs. A naive consumer relativism leads to some unsettling prospects. In fact, if we saw the implications clearly, we would likely flee such companies, families, or regimes rather than welcome them into our lives. There are frightening developments under this ideology: white supremacy, Nazi concentration camps, gangster violence, or the transhumanists who wish to redesign human beings as machines, move towards a post-human world where AI rules all. There's no doubt relativism plays into the hands of those with pernicious and malevolent motives, those who trade in raw nihilistic power. It leads to oppression, domination, pain, suffering, and death. This is our history. So I'm saying that nihilism is the end game of ethical relativism. Without a moral plumb line, societies seem headed for personal nihilism and political tyranny. The dilemma was admitted by an atheist blogger that I read recently, rationalskepticism.org. The ultimate endpoint is despair and ugly oppression, propaganda, lies, and autocratic control from the top, as we have in today's populism. A subjectivist ethic is no ethic at all. It offers neither hope for society nor psychologically healthy relationships. It consists in the blind leading the blind. There's no higher reason to get along, no moral basis for law, no place of appeal when there's a dispute. Morality must address the proper resolution of conflicts and call unjust behavior to account. Is there not another metaposition that can be more intellectually sound and existentially helpful? Despite its popularity as a virtual opiate of the masses today, in the end, relativism is found to be inconsistent and dangerous. Now we turn to some thoughts from Friedrich Nietzsche, the father of postmodernism, or the godfather of postmodernism, very influential in continental philosophy. Nietzsche's insight was this: ahead of his time, Nietzsche saw that what was to come in the West or European societies, an end to God consciousness, transcendent values, and a responsibility for the mutual good would mean that strong could impose their values on the masses. Domination would be widespread. He foresaw the Übermensch, or the Superman, Overman, and the ethics of will to power. He saw that that would entail. There is a natural progression from the ideology of relativism to strongman political culture. The view that a human is just another thing to be manipulated, managed in the world. The weak, poor, ethnic minority, and elderly would be vulnerable to victimization or scapegoating and abuse, as we see from René Girard. And he made a strong note in one of his books that not that Nietzsche cared much about victims himself. He was more in favor of the aristocrat and the strongman. Dr. Era Norenzayan, a sociologist, social psychologist of religion at UBC, writes about this in Big Gods. He talks about the idea that cultures that have believed in transcendent gods or a transcendent God have a stronger basis for human morality, for the way we treat one another. Nietzsche talked about this in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and thus speaks the bloody, oppressive past 100 years of culture. The Gulag, Dachau, killing fields of Cambodia, mass starvations, ISIS, genocide, death squads orchestrated by oppressive autocratic regimes. Relativism is bad news for the victims of war crimes. And these crimes are not just an opinion or perspective, they're real, palpable evil, crimes against our very humanity. So egregious that people have talked about them as crimes against our very humanity. Nietzsche talked about the transvaluation of all values after the death of God. For Nietzsche, truth claims about moral issues became not much more than a statement about human subjectivity, a derivative of certain sociological and psychological conditions coming out of a knowledge power center. And Nietzsche had a strong influence on Michel Foucault. His view of the moral self and his obsession was escaping this kind of domination. So little did Foucault realize that he was feeding into the oppression with his relativism and his radical individualism. A very articulate professor at Yale University on the fascism aspect of this is Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works. And I also recommend to you the BBC documentary on Nietzsche called Human All Too Human. There's the video link to that. Following Nietzsche, Max Weber brought these ideas to North America. Building on Nietzsche, working off his assumption of diversity and the subjective choice, German intellectual Max Weber suggested that the moral task was one of positing our values on reality, on the world. Personal values would replace objective standards, codes, and norms in society. Notre Dame early modern European historian Brad Gregory, one of our visitors to UBC, a very accomplished man, calls this phenomena of moral invention of values a state of hyperpluralism, that we're in a kind of state of hyperpluralism today. And Charles Taylor in the Malaise of Modernity calls it a form of expressivism. This is the idea that I am in full control of my identity, my values, my choices, and my destiny. At the bottom line of all of this is that I choose. According to Weber, humans are value makers, not good discoverers. The content of these values range widely from pro-human and compassionate to those which celebrate cruelty, as in Charles Baudelaire, sadism, or transhumanism. In this calculus, morality reduces to one's personal desires and self-interest, or a form of, I guess you could say, consumerism. It's a much thinner, less substantial morality called projectionism. This posture also entails self-justification, a kind of self-righteousness of moral behavior. Nobody can tell me what's right and wrong. So in a sense, Dr. Alistair McGrath at Oxford University, a philosopher, theologian, raises the stop sign about tolerance and relevance and relativism. To allow relevance or openness to be a greater weight than truth is, quite simply, he says, a mark of intellectual shallowness and moral irresponsibility. The first and most fundamental of all questions must be, is it true? Is it worthy of belief and trust? Unfortunately, today, ethical and epistemological relativism appear to be the opiate or the feel-good drug of the masses, uncritically held. Another warning from Jonathan Sacks, a public intellectual and former UK chief rabbi. He's deceased now. Relativism, he says this, we should challenge the relativism that tells us there is no right or wrong, when every instinct of our mind knows it is not so. It is a mere excuse to allow us to indulge in what we believe we can get away with. A world without values quickly becomes a world without value. So this is stating the warning that relativism encourages us to justify our darkest thoughts, motives, and actions, our entitlements, narcissism, egoism, cruelty, and selfishness. Okay, at this point, we'd like to pause and take a break and look at some important distinctions and various aspects of morality, which could help you in the future in thinking through your position on moral subjectivism or ethical relativism. We want to distinguish between moral facts, which come in many forms, convictions, and nuances through different cultures and worldviews. This is often the starting point for moral relativism because of globalization. We've been exposed to all these different ways of living life, raising a family, etc. Then there's moral language, which I think is not well understood as a metabiological or constitutive type of language, not a scientific language. And Charles Taylor talks about this brilliantly in his book, The Language Animal, where he sees morality, identity, and meaning work in tandem, work in an intertwined fashion. Then there's moral epistemology, how we come to understand and work with sound moral principles, norms, and reckon with moral disagreements. And this is the area of wisdom or phronesis, what's called phronesis. So knowledge of the good or virtues is an example of this moral epistemology. Moral ontology is the kind of moral universe we inhabit, including the moral fabric of society. This is the meta-ethical or moral frame perspective. And that's important distinction. Then there's the idea of moral progress or improvement. How do we see better, think better, live better, as Taylor asks us? This must come through suffering, personal transformation, maturity, and growth in character. So this is impacted, of course, by our relationship to the good and our accountability to others. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, at one of his commencement addresses at Harvard, spoke of the importance of seeing that our purpose in life was moral growth, not happiness. And David Brooks talks about this brilliantly in his book, The Second Mountain. So let's walk through this. Moral relativists claim that there are no universal norms, moral norms, while appealing to a principle of tolerance as a universal norm. In the eyes of many critics, though, the most serious objection to moral relativism is that it implies the pernicious consequence that anything goes. Most moral philosophers dislike this intensely. But the real danger, the real intellectual enemy, I suggest here, is ontological subjectivity. This is the conviction that an object or idea or moral conviction has no reality outside of a person's mind. This is called solipsism. Truth depends on me and my take on reality, not society, church, or government. It's a social constructivist view, which we find in late modern philosophers like Michel Foucault, etc. Moral statements can be true or false, right or wrong, but they only refer to people's attitudes, not their actions. Foucault took ethics to be a kind of aesthetics, a work of art, a care of self. We want to form a rebuttal against this. Yes, humans are subjectively involved in coming to know the world and making moral choices, but there must be a world objectively there prior to knowing it. This is called critical realism. Choosing a good or value requires a community within which to have serious moral and philosophical dialogue and debate. We recognize a subjective and objective pull to knowledge. Just believing something doesn't make it so. This can be pure fantasy or fideism. There are important objective criteria such as coherence, comprehensiveness, consistency, relevance, and unity, which are used to critically examine the validity and strength of a worldview. And a nice introduction to this is James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door. So this includes the whole idea of one's moral framework or moral map. For example, ethical relativism and moral subjectivism fit the worldview of pantheism, Eastern pantheism, or Western philosophical naturalism, or what's called humanism, secular humanism. What's a positive alternative to the problem of ethical relativism? The existential need for a proper moral grounding and for appropriate moral discernment never departs the human drama, never vanishes from the human psyche, no matter what kind of social and intellectual gymnastics we perform. How do we thicken relationships and personal commitments, move into adulthood, and reach our fullest moral potential? None of us wants to be treated in a relative or arbitrary manner or to be merely tolerated. We want to be loved and respected. We want justice and fairness, equality before the law. We don't want the system rigged against us or anyone else. We want to be able to trust principled people of integrity and respect servant leaders of noble character. We want our marital partner to be faithful and honest. The rich and powerful should not have the advantage in the game of life. In the competition for scarce resources, they should not get away with bad behavior, cheating, or fraud. On the cultural and business value of servant leadership, see the authors Don Page's Servant-Empowered Leadership, Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last, and Henry Cloud, Integrity. I recommend all these people. We want to explore the hierarchy of moral goods. Some values are a better fit for what we aspire to be as a human community. They are nobler, more life-affirming and nurturing, fun, creative, and unifying. Others are lower, demeaning, more death-dealing, narcissistic, divisive, malevolent, prone to violence. We believe that the way forward is the recovery of the ancient idea of the good, as we find in Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And this is a reference to a 12-part 2020 blog series that I did on Taylor and the qualities of the will. In Sources of the Self, Taylor offers a more nuanced version of what's called falsifiable moral realism. And in this, he avoids the trap of either a kind of one answer absolutism to every moral question, or a kind of who knows what's the right way to do it kind of subjectivism. He believes, against the grain of much contemporary moral philosophy, there is a hierarchy of the good. A number of top moral, philosophical, and anthropological scholars agree with him. People like Nicholas Walterstorff, Miroslav Volf, Richard Mao, J. Budiszewski, Alistair MacIntyre, and R. Scott Smith, and Oliver O'Donovan at Oxford. If ethical relativism were correct, there could be no such thing as moral improvement or purpose within a person's life or a society. To make improvement brings about social renewal. We must have high ideals and strong moral examples. We need a standard by which to judge the differences in moral values, to discern the growth of a person's character. I recommend this book by David Gill on the idea of character growth called Becoming Good. We want to say that it is quite destructive and alienating to make self-interest our highest good, which at the end of the day, moral subjectivism is making our own self-interest our highest good. Not against self-interest, but making that the center of one's moral structure is not a good thing. A robust worldview matters. How do we escape nihilism and the will to power that is endemic to the ideology of relativism? Christian theism grounds its ethical framework in the infinite goodness of a personal God and his agape love, the one who transcends human reality yet has tasted our humanity. He does offer wise arbitration, as exhibited in the Judeo-Christian biblical narrative, Old and New Testament. The moral goods are sourced in a good God who is invested in compassion, mercy, and justice. Ethics is sourced in and oriented towards what pleases God and benefits our fellow humans. So says D. Stephen Long, theologian, The Goodness of God. Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be intimately connected to this God. Humans are called to mediate this goodness to society and to the biosphere through good stewardship and the practice of the virtues, the practice of wisdom. Evil, on the other hand, or diabolos, is that which detracts people from these goals, and perverts the true, the beautiful, and the good. Selfishness, covetousness, pride, and greed stand among the capital vices which hurt people, destroy trust, and fragment society. It's often a matter of finding love in all the wrong places or meeting our needs in inappropriate ways, developing addictions, oftentimes at the expense of others, including those we love. Evil is, at the end of the day, cowardly, irresponsible, divisive, careless behavior. And it's interesting how some of the reflective existentialists like Albert Camus ask the right question. Can the idea of justice be understood without the idea of God? So in conclusion, we want to say this. Instead of naive ideological relativism that confuses us and puts us to sleep intellectually, politically, and morally, there's a tremendous need today for the courage of reflective, constructive conviction and high moral character. Society will not avoid anarchy if an appropriate moral and spiritual glue or a deeper and stronger social covenant is not found. So says Brad Gregory, The Unintended Reformation. We need a platform for healthy debate, discussion, and discernment concerning our moral future. We turn to social philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who adjures us, it's not first technology, but rather moral decision-making that will determine what kind of future we will have. It must be more substantial than a self-interested consumerism. It must be grounded in responsibility, the love and sacrifice for one's neighbor, human generosity, peacemaking, care for the poor, the weak, and planet Earth. Agape love grabs our attention as a serious alternative to relativism, offering a return on investment towards a strong moral compass, a thicker self, a deeper meaning and identity. So says Larry Siedentop in Inventing the Individual. You might also look up my YouTube video, The Transforming Power of Agape Love, on this topic. So at the end of the day, the road to freedom is paved with responsibility for the other, accountability to the common good, and human compassion and honor of God. Thank you. Here are some references, some bibliography that you can follow up in your own time if you want to do more research in this topic. And I added one that I have, a couple that I haven't mentioned in the talk towards the bottom. Rebecca Laughlin, Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion, was very good on various tough questions about the Christian faith. And Daryl Johnson's book, Who is Jesus?, is a very profound overview of the various characteristics of Jesus as a moral example and as more than a moral example. Thank you for listening. This is my book, The Great Escape from Nihilism, where I go into this in more detail. I dig a tunnel out of the prison camp of nihilism and ethical relativism and show the way forward. So you can have a look at that. So thank you very much for listening. This has been great to enjoy this seminar together. All the best.